مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. جاء انتخاب دونالد ترامب مفاجئا لمعظم الصحفيين والخبراء السياسيين هنا وفي الخارج. بالنسبة للبعض كانت هذه الأنباء طيبة، وبالنسبة للآخرين كانت هذه الأنباء محبطة. الأمر المؤكد أن الأعوام الأربعة القادمة ستختلف تمام الاختلاف عن آخر 8 أعوام. أحد عوامل فوز ترامب كان الدور الذي لعبه جناح قومي انعزالي كاره للغرباء من الحركة المحافظة الأشمل اسمه اليمين البديل. هؤلاء ليسوا محافظين تقليديين، ممن أهدافهم الرئيسة هي الحكومة الأصغر والضرائب الأقل. وهؤلاء ليسوا محافظين جدد، ممن يناصرون الديمقراطية حول العالم. وإنما بالنسبة للأعداء اليمين البديل قضايا العنصرية والنوع والثروة وحقوق حمل السلاح القضايا محورية. ما لا يبدو واضحا هو حجم الدور الذي لعبه هؤلاء الناشطون السياسيون. هل كانوا آلي الأصوات ولكن دون تأثير يذكر؟ أم أن اليمين البديل كان السلاح السري الذي قاد ترامب إلى الفوز؟ لمناقشة دور اليمين البديل في حملتنا الرئاسية يسرني أن أرحب بالمؤرخ السياسي الأستاذ ماثيو دالك. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. In our election of Donald J. Trump, there was an interesting and provocative trend of American conservatism that we saw rise to prominence for the first time in many, many years. We're going to talk about that today with Matthew Dalek. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So there are many strains of conservative politics in America. How would you separate them out?
That's a great question. Traditionally, we've seen 3 strains. National security, so-called neoconservative strain, a sort of aggressive military approach to international affairs. The architects of the Iraq War, for example, like Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld. Supply-side economics is a second one, meaning essentially cut taxes, get the government out of the marketplace, and let capitalism go free. And then the third pillar of conservatism, this third strain, is really social conservatism. So traditional values, morality as defined by conservatives, abortion, guns, same-sex marriage, women's rights. These were all issues that animated many conservatives, especially evangelical Christians, through the decades. So those have been the 3 strains for the past essentially 50 years. I think conservatism, though, is shifting now.
And what is this new phenomenon that has emerged throughout the Trump campaign and helped in some way, and we'll talk about that, helped the election of Donald Trump, what is called the alternative right or the alt-right?
Well, so the alternative right is a fairly new, first of all, it's a new term in the sense that it really emerged in popular culture and political culture in this election. And so it's not something that most people in the United States would have heard of prior to a year ago. The alternative right, and people define it differently, but it's basically white nationalism, as best as I can tell. So Breitbart News is the home of the alt-right. They're very hardline immigration. There are conspiracy theories, and we actually saw this in the Trump campaign in some of his closing arguments, some of his ads about a global media, political, financial conspiracy against him. There is a serious strain of racially charged rhetoric. So, for example, after the shooting, the racist and racially motivated shooting of 9 African American congregants, people at a church in Charleston,
South
Carolina, by a white racist who had posted images of the Confederate flag, I think on his Facebook page or on YouTube. Breitbart News ran an article celebrating the Confederate flag, saying hoist it high, hoist it proud.
So just for our viewers, the Confederate flag is the flag of the southern states 150 years ago in the American Civil War.
Yes, and some white Southerners see it as a symbol of Southern culture, Southern heritage, but it also is a symbol of Southern and actually, frankly, American racism, racial oppression, particularly of African Americans. And so on the alt-right and some of the people associated with the alt-right, there's a strain of racism, anti-Semitism that runs through it and that has affected Donald Trump's campaign.
And do we have any sense, is there any polling or any demographic data, how many people would be associated with this movement, how broad it is? Is it located necessarily in the South? Is it national? What do we know?
We don't know a ton, I don't think. I mean, I don't think that there is a whole lot of, and frankly, there's still a lot of debates about, well, what is the Tea Party, right? What's the Tea Party movement, and what is motivating that? So, clearly there are, I think Breitbart News has millions of readers. The followers, what we do know is that the followers of the alt-right have a very heavy social media presence. They're very vocal on Twitter and other social media sites. People on the alt-right and just other people in this campaign especially have attacked, especially many Republicans and conservatives who have been critical of Donald Trump. And they've attacked them in vicious terms and actually sent them images and messages so vile that law enforcement, these messages have been reported to law enforcement because these have been threats. So I think roughly in the millions. I mean, it's not like a few hundred members of the Ku Klux Klan, the sort of older white, violent white nationalist, a white supremacist movement. But how many people actually subscribe to? There's also a strain in the alt-right that talks about the establishment, again, as being rigged against the American people. Some of the language that Donald Trump and one of his chief advisors, Steve Bannon, used. And so it's hard to know exactly. I think primarily it's a more rural phenomenon. We see more rural areas also voted for Donald Trump overwhelmingly. But that's not, it's important to say that most of Donald Trump's supporters are not necessarily affiliated with the alt-right. They, people don't probably even know what it is, but there is a not insignificant strain of support behind Donald Trump that does come from the alt-right.
Is there any reason to believe that Donald Trump himself is a member of or affiliated with any movement like this, that he himself is a subscriber to some of these philosophies? Yeah, there actually is. Not that he's a card-carrying member, not that he, has a subscription, for example, to a particular alt-right organization or movement, but Trump, for example, took as one of his chief aides Steve Bannon, who is the chief executive of Breitbart News, who has said things allegedly that are anti-Semitic, that are really demeaning and degrading to women. Some of Donald Trump's rhetoric around immigration, for example, calling Mexican immigrants rapists, saying that they're sending their worst people. His attacks on a Mexican-American judge from Indiana, saying that he was biased against Donald Trump
in this civil lawsuit against Trump because he was, quote, basically of Mexican heritage. Some of Donald Trump's conspiracy theories. I mean, Trump is a real fan of conspiracies. He said that Ted Cruz, a senator from Texas, Ted Cruz's father had a hand in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Had no basis in fact, but Donald Trump said it. The global conspiracy theory. So Trump has appropriated, he has taken some of the language and some of the ideas from the alt-right. And I think that there's an important point to make here, which is that I think part of the reason why we've seen protests in the United States, why there are many Americans on the left and others, members of minority groups, who are afraid in a way that they haven't been after a recent presidential election, is because of the language that Trump has used, because of the attacks that he has made, because he has taken some of this alt-right material and made it his own in this campaign.
There is a logical paradox here. With all the conspiracy theories in the world, the fact is that Donald Trump won an election in what all observers consider a free and fair vote. In our system, you can like the popular vote electoral college system or not like it, but it's the law of the land. How do advocates of a conspiracy theory that the system is rigged against people who advocate these views, how do they balance that with the reality that, well, their guy won?
Well, that, in a way, is one of the key questions for Donald Trump, right? Because he went around, especially in the closing weeks of the campaign, but really for many months, actually, he went around, even during the Republican primary, saying the Republican Party is rigged, the political system is rigged against me, the economic system is rigged against working class Americans. And then, of course, as you said, he won. He won clearly. There's no dispute. Even, his fiercest critics are not disputing the result. I think you're going to have to ask people who support these conspiracy theories, who promote them, how they. My guess is that they'll continue to say that there is a conspiracy, that the system is rigged, but that Donald Trump was able to break through it. But they'll still say, well, there's still a political establishment, there's still Wall Street, there's still the United Nations, there are still these larger distant forces, which is really a core element of populism, right, that are removed from the people, that are controlling their lives and kind of keeping them down. And so, in a way, the evidence of Trump's victory, the evidence that the political system is not rigged, I'm not sure that then translates and causes people to rethink, well, actually, there aren't these conspiracies. They don't really exist.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about the historical context of these sorts of nativist or populist movements in American history in just a moment. Our guest today is Matthew Dalek. Matthew is one of America's leading scholarly experts on politics, especially conservative politics. He is an associate professor at George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management, a political historian, and a frequent commentator in news media on politics, history, and public affairs. Professor Dalek received his undergraduate degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and his doctorate from Columbia University in New York. In a past life, he was speechwriter for House Minority Leader Richard Gephardt. Born and raised in Los Angeles, he lives here in Washington with his wife and 2 sons. So before we go to history, I did want to ask if you could identify what you think would be 1 or 2 sort of legislative or policy victories that this movement that we've been discussing would like to see from a Trump administration to validate their support for this candidate.
Well, so beyond personnel appointments, the appointment of someone like Steve Bannon, there are particular legislative agenda items. Building the wall on the southern border, that was one of the animating issues of Donald Trump's campaign. It was a core a message, a core feature at most of his rallies. And if Trump were to actually build this wall, it would be a symbol of his hardline anti-immigration stance. I think that there is a lot of support for rounding up and deporting undocumented immigrants. And that was another, at one point Donald Trump said, well, we're going to have a deportation force. He has since scaled that back. He says we're going to deport 2 to 3 million. It's unclear how much more aggressive he will be than President Obama on that score, but that could be both in terms of policy and symbolically important to members of the alt-right and frankly other people who are not associated with the alt-right but who just support his hardline immigration. So I think that's a core issue.
Now, I did want to put this in some historic context because as provocative as some of the language has been in this campaign, America has gone through waves in the past of populist uprising, if you will, political uprising, not violent, but mostly political uprising against immigration, against the other, against change. How would you put the Trump campaign in that historical fabric of American history?
Yeah, so the caution that I would begin with is that Trump is distinct, I think. He does represent something that we have not seen before in the sense that, he came out of reality TV, out of business. We've never had someone who hasn't had military and or government experience become the president. The other point is that a lot of these sort of populist political uprisings that you mentioned, which have been very powerful, they haven't, in most cases, resulted in a presidential victory. And the president, but there are echoes. George Wallace was governor of Alabama. He ran for president as a third-party candidate in 1968. He was a segregationist. He wanted to defend the system of racial segregation in the South, but he really spoke to the so-called silent majority, white working-class voters, not just in the South, but also in the North. And Wallace did very well in that 1968 campaign. Going back further, and Richard Nixon, of course, and as did Ronald Reagan, a lot of these themes.
The silent majority.
The silent majority, right. The idea of law and order, of a society spinning out of control, making racial appeals, coded as they were, but still appeals. And so, there's an echo in that. Going back further, Huey Long, a governor of Louisiana during the Great Depression, a time of economic turmoil, had a program called Share Our Wealth. Father Coughlin, another a populist, fiery populist. Later on in the 1930s, he became really anti-Semitic. But for a while there, he had a huge radio following. And I think they called him the radio preacher. And he also, in part, preached a message that resonated with a lot of primarily white, working class, in that case Catholics, over economic unfairness. Again, this idea of, there are a handful of people at the top who are, ripping off everybody else. And of course, it goes back in part to Andrew Jackson, in the president in the early 19th century. So these appeals, this idea that Wall Street, the banks, the original populist movement was in the 1890s, made up primarily of farmers, as a revolt against both large-scale economic forces and social forces, but also against a sense that New York and Washington and distant capitals were depriving farmers of the ability to work and make money. And so it really does go back in time. But again, Williams Jennings Bryan, the leader of the populist movement in the 1890s, he didn't win.
Right. And so we only have a few seconds left. Do you think populist nativism is here to stay? Is it now embedded as a much deeper and broader movement in our politics?
I think it has always been there. It has always been there. I mean, going back again almost to the founding. But it has surged up. And I think that there is politics changes very quickly, and that there is a cyclical element to a lot of this, and that these movements, they tend to peter out to some extent. So I don't want to minimize its strength, its potency, but I don't think that this is necessarily, the permanent condition of American politics. And part of it depends, frankly, on how Donald Trump governs. And if he is deeply unpopular at 35% approval ratings 3 or 4 years from now, that movement is going to look very different from it does today.
Okay. Matthew Dalek, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Washington.
Thank you.
Excellent. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول التغيرات في السياسات المحافظة في أمريكا، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.